There is a particular kind of genius that is almost impossible to recognize when you first encounter it, because it tends to arrive in a form that looks nothing like what genius is supposed to look like, wrapped in something unconventional and strange and difficult to categorize, something that challenges the assumptions of everyone who looks at it and therefore gets dismissed by most of them, before they have taken the time to understand what they are actually looking at. The history of military technology is full of examples of this phenomenon, moments when a genuinely revolutionary idea was ignored or ridiculed by the establishment that should have embraced it, only to be vindicated years or decades later when an enemy adopted the idea and demonstrated its value on the battlefield in ways that could not be argued with. But even by the standards of military history, which has produced more than its share of ignored geniuses and vindicated visionaries, the story of J. Walter Christie and his M1932 tank stands out as one of the most remarkable and most frustrating examples of institutional blindness in the entire history of armored warfare. A story in which an American engineer produced what was arguably the most important single innovation in tank design of the 20th century, watched his own country reject it as impractical and too expensive, and then saw every major military power in the world adopt his ideas and use them to build the tanks that would fight the Second World War. J. Walter Christie was not the kind of man who made it easy to appreciate his genius, because he was also difficult, argumentative, financially chaotic, and constitutionally incapable of navigating the bureaucratic and political landscape of military procurement in a way that might have persuaded the people who controlled defense spending to invest in his ideas. He had been designing racing cars and military vehicles since the early 20th century, and he had developed an intuitive understanding of suspension design and vehicle dynamics that was far ahead of the formal engineering theory of his era. An understanding that he expressed not in academic papers or formal proposals, but in actual vehicles that he built in his workshop and drove at speeds that seemed impossible to anyone who had seen the state of tank technology at the time. His approach to the fundamental problem of tank design, which is the tension between the protection provided by heavy armor and the mobility that makes a tank tactically useful, was different from the approach taken by most of his contemporaries, and the difference was not a matter of degree, but of fundamental philosophy about what a tank was supposed to do and how it was supposed to do it. The conventional wisdom of tank design in the late 1920s and early 1930s held that tanks were primarily infantry support weapons, slow-moving armored vehicles that accompanied foot soldiers across the battlefield and provided them with firepower and protection against enemy machine guns and light artillery. This conception of the tank's role naturally led to designs that prioritized armor protection and firepower over speed and mobility, producing vehicles that were heavily armored and heavily armed, but also slow and mechanically unreliable. Vehicles that could survive on a relatively static battlefield, but that lacked the speed and range to exploit breakthroughs or conduct the kind of deep penetration operations that would eventually define the most successful armored operations of the Second World War. Christie looked at this conventional wisdom and concluded that it was fundamentally wrong, that the tank's greatest potential lay not in supporting infantry, but in acting as an independent mobile striking force that could move faster than any enemy could respond to, penetrating deep behind enemy lines and destroying the logistics and command infrastructure that kept enemy armies functioning. To realize this vision, Christie needed a suspension system that could allow a tank to move at high speed across rough ground without shaking itself to pieces or becoming undrivable, And the suspension system he developed to solve this problem was the innovation that would eventually transform tank design across the entire world. The Christie suspension used large road wheels connected to long coil springs through a system of levers that allowed each wheel to move independently over large obstacles while keeping the hull relatively stable. A design that sounds straightforward in description, but that represented a fundamental breakthrough in practice because it allowed vehicles equipped with it to travel at speeds and across terrain that were simply impossible for tanks using the conventional suspension systems of the era. Christie demonstrated the capabilities of his suspension system in a series of dramatic public demonstrations in which his vehicles crossed rough terrain at speeds that observers refused to believe until they saw them with their own eyes. And the performance he achieved was not a marginal improvement over existing technology, but a difference so dramatic that it seemed to belong to a different category of vehicle entirely. The M1932, which represented the mature expression of Christie's design philosophy, was a vehicle that embodied a completely different vision of what a tank could be. It was fast, extraordinarily fast by the standards of the era, capable of speeds exceeding 120 kilometers per hour on roads when the tracks were removed, and it ran on its large road wheels alone, a feature that Christie had incorporated to extend the vehicle's operational range by allowing it to travel on roads without the mechanical wear and fuel consumption associated with tracked operation. It was relatively lightly armored compared to the heavy infantry support tanks that dominated military thinking at the time, reflecting Christie's belief that speed and mobility were more valuable forms of protection than steel plate, because a vehicle that could move faster than the enemy could aim at it was harder to hit than a vehicle that could absorb the hits it inevitably received. It had a suspension system that allowed it to cross rough terrain at speeds that made it effectively immune to the horse-drawn artillery that still constituted a significant portion of most armies' anti-tank capability, because by the time a horse-drawn gun could be brought into action, a Christie suspension vehicle would already be somewhere else entirely. The United States Army looked at all of this and decided they were not interested, a decision that reflected not stupidity, but the institutional conservatism and budget constraints of an army that was operating in the post-World War I environment of severe defense spending cuts and was committed to a conception of tank warfare that Christie's designs challenged at a fundamental level. The cavalry branch of the U.S. Army, which might have been expected to embrace a fast tank that embodied the traditional cavalry values of speed and shock, was legally prohibited from operating tanks under the National Defense Act of 1920, which restricted tank operation to the infantry branch, and the infantry branch wanted slow, heavily armored tanks that could support foot soldiers rather than fast, lightly armored vehicles that could conduct independent operations. Christie tried to sell his designs through official channels, fought with procurement bureaucrats, missed deadlines, exceeded budgets, and generally behaved in the way that difficult geniuses throughout history have behaved when forced to deal with institutions that do not understand what they are offering, and the result was a series of contracts canceled, proposals rejected, and vehicles built at Christie's own expense that demonstrated capabilities the Army officially maintained it did not need. What happened next is one of the great ironies of military history, because while the United States Army was rejecting Christie's suspension system as impractical and his vehicles as too expensive and too unconventional, the Soviet Union was paying extremely close attention to everything Christie was doing and drawing very different conclusions about its military value. Soviet military observers had watched Christie's demonstrations with considerable interest, and in 1930, the Soviet government purchased two M1928 Christie vehicles, officially listed in the export documentation as agricultural tractors in a transparent fiction that fooled nobody but satisfied the legal requirements, and shipped them to the Soviet Union, where they were thoroughly analyzed by Soviet engineers who immediately recognized what they were looking at. The Christie suspension was incorporated into the BT series of fast tanks that the Soviet Union began producing in large numbers in the early 1930s. And from the BT series, it was a direct evolutionary path to the T-34, the tank that would become the most important single weapon system of the Second World War on the Eastern Front, and that used a modified Christie suspension as a fundamental element of its design. The British also recognized what Christie had achieved before their American counterparts did, and the cruiser tank series that Britain developed in the late 1930s used Christie suspension systems that gave these vehicles performance characteristics that conventional suspension designs could not match. The A-13 cruiser tank, which was directly derived from Christie's designs, became the basis for the Crusader and eventually influenced the entire direction of British tank development through the war years. And the fact that British tank design in the early war period was at least competitive with German tank design in terms of mobility, if not always in terms of reliability, owed a substantial debt to the work of an American engineer whom the U.S. Army had largely ignored. Meanwhile, the Americans themselves eventually came around to recognizing the value of Christie's ideas. But by the time they did the work of development and refinement had been done by others, and the most important applications of Christie's fundamental innovation would be found not in American tanks, but in Soviet and British vehicles that had taken his ideas and developed them while he was still arguing with procurement officials in Washington. Christie himself never received the recognition or the financial reward that his contributions to tank design arguably merited, spending his later years in the same financial difficulty and institutional frustration that had characterized most of his career, a difficult man whose genius had been genuinely revolutionary and whose inability to work within institutional constraints had prevented him from personally benefiting from the ideas that transformed armored warfare. He died in 1944, the year before the end of the war that was being fought with tanks whose performance characteristics owed an enormous and largely unacknowledged debt to his work, close enough to the final vindication of his ideas to have understood what his suspension system had made possible, but perhaps not close enough to fully appreciate the scale of what he had contributed. The M1932 that everyone laughed at, the ridiculous American tank that was too fast and too unconventional and too expensive and too difficult to fit into the established categories of military thinking, had quietly become the blueprint for the most important tanks of the most mechanized war in human history. And the man who built it deserved far better than history gave him.